Thank you for tuning in today to my discussion of Saints, Volume 2. I'll be first giving a general overview of the book and then discussing how we treated Brigham Young. I'm representing a team of writers, historians, editors, and others who work at the Church History Department. We've been charged by church leaders to write a 4-volume history of the church that will be rigorous in its history, transparent in its approach to topics, written in a style that is accessible and pleasing to read, and faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ. I've been involved with this project for the past decade, and it's really been an amazing thing to work on. We released Volume 1 in September 2018. This volume begins with Joseph Smith's boyhood and ends with the dedication of the Nauvoo Temple, where the saints received their endowments and were sealed together before the Great Trek West. Volume 2 picks up as the saints leave Nauvoo and ends with the dedication of the Salt Lake Temple. Volume 3, and here you can see the covers of all 4 books, will take us to the dedication of the Swiss Temple, the first temple outside of areas where there were large numbers of Latter-day Saints. And that dedication took place in 1955. And Volume 4 will take us somewhere near the present. On the cover of that volume, there are images of temples in Hong Kong, Sao Paulo, Brazil, and Accra, Ghana. If we do our job well, our hope is that the 4 volumes will meld together into a great panorama of faith and teach the church how God has guided and directed his children in the latter days. We released Volume 2 in February of this year. It is now available in print and electronically in 14 languages. We have been blown away by the reception of both Volumes 1 and 2. The books are bestsellers by any measurement, both in terms of print copies and especially in the electronic and audio use of the volume on the Gospel Library app and other channels. There is a hunger among Latter-day Saints around the world to understand the history of the church. And it is our firm belief that a better understanding of the history of the church will build faith among Latter-day Saints of all generations. The intent is especially to reach what the scriptures call the rising generation, by which we mean people in their late teens and 20s, to fortify them in their faith. But we believe that all Latter-day Saints can benefit from reading the books. The main theme of Volume 2 is to demonstrate a covenant people living the gospel of Jesus Christ and taking that gospel message to the world. I want to briefly touch on 5 themes of the volume: the global church, the gathering, restoration of truth, challenges, and the temple. If you've read Volume 1, you'll notice that Volume 2 is more global in scope and reach than that first volume. This map from the inside of the front cover gives some idea of the locations that are covered. Significant stories take place in Europe. Missionaries go to Africa and Asia. And missionaries also find great success in the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii, the Society Islands, what we call Tahiti, Tonga, Samoa, and other places in Polynesia. Traditionally, we have told the story of the global church as it might appear in this photograph. Courageous missionaries and their families leave Utah and take the gospel to areas all around the world. We're able to tell these stories because so many of these missionaries kept records. We have journals and letters. What we often don't see and often don't include in our stories are the local voices, the views and perspectives of those who joined the church around the world. But if we zoom into this photograph, we can see that they are there. Most of the surviving records were created by the largely American missionaries. We have to work harder to see and consider their perspective and voices of the local converts, the local church members all around the world. We've tried hard in Saints Volume 2 to tell the story from both the perspectives, that you see in that original in the larger photograph, and the perspective of the local church members that you see when you zoom in here. Volume 2 also tells the story of the gathering, of the vision of creating a Zion people and how that vision impelled converts from around the world to come to the American West. So we tell the story of the pioneer exodus, the story of the Mormon Battalion and the ship Brooklyn, of the handcarts, the Perpetual Emigrating Fund, then how that all changed with the Transcontinental Railroad, and how it all led to the settlement of Latter-day Saints across the West. Now in Saints, we always try to remember that we are trying to tell what we call a small plates history. Among the Nephites, we learn in the Book of Mormon that record keepers kept both the large plates, in which they talked about politics and the military and economics, and they kept the small plates that were reserved for the things of God, the spiritual successes and failures of the people. In Volume 2, we also tell the story of the continuing restoration. So we tell the story of the word and will of the Lord as it came to Brigham Young, pictured here as a young man. And then how revelation to both Brigham and to others in the church led to the reestablishment of Relief Society, the development of programs that would become what we know today as young women's, young men's, Sunday school, and primary. We make clear in Volume 2 that revelation does not just come to the prophet. The story of these organizations is a story of how revelation came to many members of the church who were seeking solutions to problems they faced. Revelation came, of course, to the prophets as well, sometimes when ideas, such as primary, were presented to them, or to him. One of our responsibilities in Saints is to also teach about the challenging moments and themes in our history. I've often used the phrase from a British novelist to explain our perspective about the past. He said, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." For me, that means that we need to understand the difficult moments in our past within the context of their times, as well as in the context of how God works with his people. If we want to understand people in the past, we have to understand the times and the culture in which they lived. We don't want to be an ugly tourist to the past, quickly passing judgment and condemnation. Of course, we're not going to agree with everything in the past, and we shouldn't. But understanding comes through a knowledge of the context and of what the people themselves felt and understood and were trying to accomplish. One of the things that may surprise some people in Saints Volume 2 is how pervasive plural marriage was among the Latter-day Saints from the 1840s until the 1890s and somewhat beyond. We begin the story of plural marriage in Volume 1, but it is in Volume 2 that plural marriage comes to be a much larger practice among the Latter-day Saints. We tell stories from the perspective of the individuals involved, meaning that we hear from the men and women themselves about their experiences, both good and bad, both faithful and challenging, as they wrestle to implement a new marriage system. And then, at the end of the volume, how they left that system behind. We demonstrate how both the beginning and the end of plural marriage was governed by revelation through prophets. We make clear that not all Latter-day Saints were involved in plural marriage. You could be a monogamist and a faithful Latter-day Saint. Indeed, when considering that plural marriage was only practiced to any large degree in the American West, and when keeping in mind both the monogamous families in the American West and then the congregations of saints in Europe and Polynesia and elsewhere, it's clear that the majority of Latter-day Saint marriages at the time were monogamous. Even so, plural marriage brought significant legal and political challenges to the saints, and we tell these stories as well. Of course, there are other challenging stories. We discuss the priesthood and temple restrictions that barred those of Black African descent from priesthood ordination and from temple ordinances, with the exception of baptism for the dead. We show the faithfulness of Black saints, including Jane Manning James and Samuel and Amanda Chambers. it is important to tell this story from their perspective. We also discussed the challenging topic of the racial views of Brigham Young, making clear that he borrowed mistaken racial ideas from the culture of his day. Perhaps no other aspect of Brigham's life is being discussed more right now than his views on race. And he is a complicated figure on this topic, as are many 19th century Americans. He praised one black priesthood holder, Q. Walker Lewis, as one of the best elders in the church. On another occasion, he said, "Color doesn't matter." And yet, he strongly opposed marriages or relationships between blacks and whites and announced the priesthood and temple restrictions. The racial issues that Brigham faced were not just about African Americans or slavery. In many ways, the more pressing issue for him was about American Indians, whom Brigham and other Latter-day Saints saw as descendants of the Lamanites in the Book of Mormon. In 1835, Joseph Smith gave Brigham Young a commission, a blessing, to open the preaching of the gospel to Indian nations. And he took that charge seriously throughout his life. Now, in Volume 2, we talk about significant moments of tension and, at times, violence between Native Americans and Latter-day Saints. We also demonstrate how, against much of the culture of his day, Brigham took actions repeatedly to advocate for peace with Native Americans, even when some of his own people wanted more aggressive and sometimes violent actions. We discuss the complicated relationships between white Latter-day Saints and American Indians, including some, such a significant number of Shoshone, who are discussed in the volume, who joined the church and became faithful saints themselves. We also discuss other difficult topics in the volume, including the Mountain Meadows Massacre, the abominable actions taken by some saints in southern Utah against innocent victims, and then the significant effect that tragic event had on the church. Latter-day Saint efforts to build temples, to be endowed with power from on high and be eternally sealed to their families, is perhaps the central theme of the Saints' volumes. You can tell that from the cover images. Volume 2 includes the formal dedication of the Nauvoo Temple in May 1846, after most saints had already left the city. And it features the construction and dedication of 4 pioneer-era temples: St. George, Logan, Manti, and Salt Lake City. In the St. George Temple, the first endowments for the dead were performed, and the rituals were standardized. And the book ends with the marvelous dedication of the Salt Lake Temple. When we set the release date for the book, we didn't know that it would coincide with the shutting down of that temple in January of this year for its remodeling. The Saints Project does not just include the text of the main narratives. It also includes several other resources, including what we call church history topics, church history videos, global histories, and a weekly Saints podcast. Particularly want to mention here global histories. These are found on your Gospel Library app, and they contain short histories of the church for dozens of countries around the world. There you'll find chronologies, you'll find information, but especially you'll find stories of faith of Latter-day Saints who have built the church. The church history topics are short essays meant to give additional context on particular issues within the book. So we published over 60 of these with Saints Volume 2, and you can see the full list here. We also published 9 short videos that cover lots of the topics in the book. For instance, given that it's relevant to what we'll talk about today, I'll point out the second video here, Brigham Young, the Prophet and the Man, in which Jenny Lund and myself talk about how to think about Brigham Young in our current context. And then I'd also like to encourage you to become acquainted with the Saints podcast, which has weekly episodes involving a host, a historian, and a reader discussing a chapter or two of the narrative. It's a great place to get additional insight and perspective. I want to end my overview of the volume by quoting Elder Quentin L. Cook. When Saints Volume 1 was launched, I had the privilege of participating with Elder Cook and historian Kate Holbrook in a face-to-face event for the youth and young adults of the church in front of the Nauvoo Temple. I've come to greatly respect and love Elder Cook. He's deeply informed on matters of church history. This quote summarizes the main motivation for the Saints Project. He says, "I would hope that the ultimate result would be a deep appreciation of our ancestors and the sacrifices and the hardships they went through. And that would empower us as a people today to face our difficulties and give us strength and power to overcome the issues that face us today." That is our hope, our motivation, our prayer for the Saints Projects. Now, let's talk about Brigham. If you've read Saints, you'll know that our method is to write several short scenes per chapter that are told from the viewpoint of an individual. All of the scenes, even down to small details, are based on historical documents. We aim to balance different perspectives between church leaders and church members, between women and men, between young and old, between citizens of various countries. Of course, prophets play a central role in the books, but we want to show them not alone, but as deeply embedded within the community of saints. Joseph Smith was the leading character of Volume 1, as you would expect, and Brigham Young is a central character of Volume 2. Historical individuals are generally tough to understand. We only know them through the scraps they left behind, or through what other people at the time said about them. We can't talk with them ourselves. We can't get a feel for their mannerisms. We can't judge through personal interaction if they come across as sincere or selfish, kind or haughty. I've written biographies of Thomas Cain and Parley Pratt, both important figures in the early years of the church. After I wrote the biographies, I thought to myself, do I really know these men? Do I understand what made them tick, what motivated them, what they were really like on a personal level? Of course, there are limits to historical knowledge. I'm not sure that I really do know them. Perhaps when I get to the other side, I'll be able to judge for myself. And I expect that they'll let me know what I got right and what I got wrong. Brigham Young is more complex than most historical figures. He's really tough to understand, but not because he left behind only scraps. He left behind volumes, thousands and thousands of letters, both incoming and outgoing, hundreds of pages of journals, mostly kept by his clerks, transcripts of hundreds of sermons, both as recorded as they were at the time in shorthand, and then as published in the newspapers or the Journal of Discourses. And thousands of people left observations about Brigham Young. He was larger than life. He was a celebrity, often appearing in newspapers around the world. What is fact? What is fiction? What is surface? What is core? What was he really like? And he wasn't on this public stage for just a few years. He led the church for over 3 decades. Even before that, he was a public figure. Along with what we're doing in the Saints volumes, I'm writing a biography of Brigham Young that I'll talk about in a few minutes. And writing about Brigham is difficult because of his family relationships. When I wrote about Thomas Cain, I tried to understand the relationship between he and his wife Elizabeth. It's tough to understand a marriage retrospectively through the documents left behind. When I wrote about Parley Pratt, I tried to understand the relationship between he and the 12 women that he married. That was tougher. But Brigham was sealed to dozens of women, 16 of whom lived in his households. The problem is compounded because our culture is so different than his. Perceptions of Brigham today often rest on our own beliefs on topics like gender and race and authority and politics. People today wonder if he was sexist or racist or authoritarian or violent. And certainly by our standards, he said things that make us cringe at times. Sometimes I have thought, reading a document, why did you say that, Brigham? And why did you have to say it like that? But he also said things that would strike us as quite profoundly progressive and insightful for his age, of his support for women's education and voting, of his advocacy of peace with Native Americans and appreciation for their humanity, of his deliberately leading the saints across the plains rather than risk more violence in Illinois. He would rather be wronged than do wrong, he told the saints on many, many occasions. Another important thing to remember about Brigham is that, like all of us, he grew and matured throughout his life as he gained experience and wisdom and as he experienced the tutoring of the Lord. Several years ago, I worked on a documentary history of the Relief Society, along with several others, that was published by the Church Historians Press as the first 50 years of Relief Society. We included a document that quoted Brigham Young explaining why the Relief Society would not be reorganized following the death of Joseph Smith. Brigham had had a falling out with Emma Smith, who was president of the Relief Society. And in those dark moments of 1845, months after the martyrdom of the prophet Joseph Smith, when Brigham perceived threats against the church on nearly every side, he said hard things about Emma and about the Relief Society and about the role of women. But as I worked on that book, I learned that we cannot leave Brigham Young in 1845 in the shadow of Joseph's death as he wondered how he could possibly lead the church forward, how he could preserve the lives of the saints and their religion. No, to understand his views on women, we have to follow him to Utah. In 1868, he asked Eliza Snow to reorganize the Relief Society, and he became a major advocate for relief societies, for the role of women in the church and in society, for voting rights for women, for education for women. If we only looked at what Brigham said in 1845, we would miss the growth, and we would do him an injustice. We need to allow room for historical figures to grow and learn and mature. Today, I would like to suggest a few keys to understanding Brother Brigham, primarily as revealed in Saints Volume 2. Besides helping with Saints, I'm writing a biography, as I mentioned. To give a sense of Brigham's life and the complexity of his interests and his thinking, I'd like to quote from an introduction written by my co-author, Ron Walker. I'm finishing a book begun by Ron, who passed away a few years ago. Ron is a world-class historian and thinker and writer. He spent decades trying to understand Brigham. I have tremendous respect for Ron, but I do get the last word in our collaboration. Ron wrote this: "What was there about this man that caused such polar emotion? President Brigham Young stirred the emotions of both saint and sinner, friend and foe. Brigham confused, embittered, dominated, engaged, convulsed, but also shaped, built, and made the Latter-day Saint scene from the time he assumed his leadership in 1844 to the moment he exited 33 years later. Some described his aspect as that of a prosperous New England farmer, plainly dressed, seemingly unhurried. About 5 feet 8 inches tall, about average for the time, he had a strong physique, which he bore with a conscious presence. One knew when he or she were in Brigham Young's presence. By Brigham's own admission, when called to the Quorum of the 12, some murmured. They thought him a disgrace to the house of Israel, who needed a figurative stool to reach high enough to tie the shoes of some of the more accomplished apostles. Sometimes there was pettiness to the complaints, but Brigham himself understood his lack of sheen. When first assuming church leadership, at times he was inwardly uncertain, which he masked with an occasional bluster. I used to think, until I was 45 years of age, that I had not knowledge, sense, or ability enough to enable me to associate with the men of the world, he said of this period of his life. What a change later life made. he became quite simply the ablest Latter-day Saint of his generation. If judged by breadth of interest, creativity, force of will, shrewdness, or that knack which some men and women have to impel things and make things happen, our church probably has never seen his equal. His office journal chronicles some of his interests. He had one of the territory's first sewing machines brought to his office for personal scrutiny. He showed an amateur's interest in the microscope and telescope. Books on smelting and iron making were read to him, and the next day several scripts for a proposed dramatic production. He briefly studied phonography, today we would say stenography, and for many years doggedly sought a revolution in English spelling. A chemist gave him a private lecture on the poisonous property contained in salt poison. And Young and his circle of advisors might discuss naval armaments, Nevada statehood, the politics of Washington, D.C., or the making of molasses. When time permitted, he walked a half block from his office to ensure sobriety at the social hall, or another few paces south to regulate the Salt Lake Theater. One prominent actress thought him better informed on stage management than many Eastern professionals. I hope that gives a sense for his range of interests. He had an intense curiosity, a drive to understand the world. Now, let me give you 3 keys to understanding Brigham that might run counter to some current perceptions about him. Key number 1. The people loved Brigham because he was one of them. He was not authoritarian. A fellow historian sent me a quote a few weeks ago that he had come across while reading the Teachers' Corps minutes of the Salt Lake 20th Ward for 1860. In those days, teachers were grown men, not 14-year-old boys. John Lyon Sr. told the meeting, "I have been 7 years in the valley. I ought to be a good man, for I have been immediately under the auspices of the servants of God. And it only required a person to become acquainted with the president to love him." He further said he did not believe there was a man on earth that could hate Brigham. I think that's really powerful. Brigham's detractors then and now have portrayed him as a thoroughly unlikable person. But in reality, the saints who knew Brigham loved him. Brigham expressed his vision for his people. Suppose we had the power to take the poor and the ignorant, the low and the degraded, who are trodden underfoot by the great and the powerful among earth's inhabitants, and bring them together and purify them and fill them with knowledge and understanding and make a nation of them worthy of admiration. What would you say to this? We have to understand what he was trying to accomplish. In his 30s, he had served a mission to England, where he had seen firsthand the excesses of the Industrial Revolution, of capitalism, of how it ground down the poor, of how a few people accumulated great riches and the many suffered for it. These were the conditions that gave rise to Karl Marx and others. But Brigham found his solution in religion, which he believed would inspire cooperation in living and in economics, a cooperation that would insulate his people from the excesses of both poverty and of wealth. He thought that both could be and often were destructive to people and their welfare and their spirituality. He believed in education for both men and women, in the dignity of work, and in the ability of cooperation to build unity and design society. Sometimes when we hear some people's perception of Brigham as an authoritarian, harsh leader who cared little for those around him, we don't know why people would follow him across the street. But they followed him across the country. They went where he asked them to go, across all the far-flung valleys and mountains of the American West, and on missions across the world. They shared his vision. They went because they believed in the gospel of Jesus Christ. But they also followed Brigham because they believed that he had their best interests in mind, that he was one of them. They didn't call him President Young, for the most part. They called him Brother Brigham. And there's great significance in that. A woman from the East Thomas Caine's wife, Elizabeth, once accompanied Brigham's caravan as it went from Salt Lake City to St. George at the beginning of the winter in 1872. Her husband, Thomas, was a great defender of the saints, a non-Latter-day Saint himself. But Elizabeth had enormous suspicions of Brigham when they began their journey. He won her over in part because he so clearly loved people. As they made their way, they would stop at people's homes for the night. And she wrote, "When we reached the end of a day's journey, after changing our clothes, washing off the dust," she says, "it was the custom of our party to assemble before the fire in the sitting room, and the leading brothers and sisters of the settlement would come in to pay their respects." Then she talks about how more and more people would drop by. At these informal audiences, reports, complaints, and petitions were made. And I think I gathered more of the actual working of Mormonism by listening to them than from any other source. They talked away to Brigham Young about every conceivable manner and expected him to remember every child in every family. And he really seemed to do so, and to be at home, and be rightfully deemed infallible on every subject. "I think he must make fewer mistakes than most popes," she said, "from his being in such constant intercourse with his people. I noticed that he never seemed uninterested, but gave an unforced attention to the person addressing him, which suggested a mind free from care." So the saints loved Brigham because he was one of them. He didn't just lead from the pulpit or from his office in the Beehive House. He led from all over the territory, deeply immersed in the saints' problems and circumstances. We try to show this throughout Saints Volume 2. One image that I love comes from the early part of the trek west as the saints left Nauvoo and struggled across Iowa in the spring rains and muds and mire of 1846. The volume reads, "On April 6th, the 16th anniversary of the organization of the church, rain fell all day. Brigham spent hours up to his knees in mud, helping the saints along the road to a place called Locust Creek. There he helped to arrange wagons, pitch tents, and chop wood until all the saints were settled in the camp. One woman who saw him in the mud, pushing and pulling to free a mired wagon, thought he looked as happy as a king, despite the challenges surrounding him." I think that's a really powerful image. A Brigham up to his knees in the mud, out actively helping the saints. And his attitude is powerful, that he's doing this with a smile on his face and a cheerful attitude. Another moment that captures Brigham's humanity and a glimpse of why the saints loved him occurs late in his life, in a scene that involves the young Heber J. Grant. This photograph of Brigham in 1876 depicts how he would have looked like. Heber at this time was 20 years old. Wards in Salt Lake City had been tasked with raising funds for the completion of the St. George Temple. Heber's bishop asked him to raise funds for the ward since he was a counselor in the Young Men's Mutual Improvement Association. Heber agreed and explained that young people would want to attend the party that he would plan if they could waltz. This was a dance that involved partners holding each other close while spinning across the dance floor in a large circle. Some older saints thought that waltzes were less proper than more traditional dances, and Brigham had struck a compromise: 3 waltzes per dance per party. Heber's bishop disapproved entirely of waltzes, but he agreed to go along with the plan of 3 per Brigham's policy. So Brigham showed up to the party as well. Saints tells us that evening Heber counted the money as people bought their tickets, while Brigham counted the waltzes. At the end of the party, Heber decided to see if he could push the envelope just a little bit. So he asked the band leader to play a waltz quadrille, which is a waltz that contained elements of more traditional square dances. As the band began playing, Heber took a seat behind Brigham to hear what he would say when he saw the 4th waltz. Sure enough, as soon as the young people began to dance, Brigham said, "They are waltzing." No, Heber explained. When they waltz all around the room. This is a quadrille. Brigham looked at Heber and laughed. Oh, you boys, he said. Now, perhaps we didn't need to include a scene about the 13th Ward dance, but we wanted to accomplish a few things. Give a glimpse of social life, show how ward activities were connected to temple building, illustrate the sorts of things done by the mutual improvement associations, and introduce the reader to the personality of Heber J. Grant, who becomes a very important figure later. And to show a side of Brigham's personality that people often miss. He connected with people. He understood and he loved the saints, and they understood and loved him. Let's talk about key number 2 to understanding Brigham. While plural marriage is particularly difficult for many Latter-day Saints in our day to understand, Brigham's involvement in plural marriage was motivated by what he understood was a commandment of God, and there was much to admire in the way that he led his complex family. In terms of public perception in his day, no issue loomed as large for Brigham as plural marriage. Brigham's many marriages defined him in the public mind for most Americans, and his reputation as a polygamist was international. For most saints today, perhaps no historical topic is as difficult to reconcile to our modern sensibilities as polygamy. This slide shows a photograph of Brigham Young and his plural wife, Margaret Pierce. On this topic, we wanted to humanize Brigham, to give insights into him as a husband and father of a very complex family. We do this through the eyes of his daughter, Susie. We know her today as Susie Young Gates, one of the most significant leaders of Latter-day Saint women in the late 1800s and early 1900s, whose advocacy for genealogy was key to the church's efforts in family history. We first meet Susie as a sickly 9-year-old in 1865. We see the Lion House through her eyes. Much of Brigham's life was lived in a world of men, the life of government officials, explorers, other church leaders. But the Lion House was a decidedly female space, with Brigham's wives and daughters. He had many more daughters living at the Lion House than sons. This photograph shows the Big Ten. 10 of his daughters, including Susie, who were roughly the same age. In the first paragraph of the first scene involving Susie, we see her as a 9-year-old running too fast and, because she seems to have had asthma, having difficulty breathing. Her father picks her up in his arms, holds her close, and whispers, "Wait a minute, daughter. Don't get in such a hurry. Take time to breathe." From there, we are introduced to the Lion House, where Susie was growing up with roughly 30 brothers and sisters. Brigham had 56 children total, some of whom were older and already moved out, and others who had died young. But it wasn't just Susie and her siblings. We learned that the Youngs also took in orphans and neighborhood children, including Heber Grant, often played at the Lion House or joined in the Young family prayers. For Susie, this was all normal. Saint states, as a small girl, Susie thought that it was perfectly normal to have such a large family and for her father to live with more than a dozen wives. In fact, her family was not typical even among plural families, which were usually far smaller by comparison. Unlike her father, most men in the church who practiced plural marriage had only 2 wives. We thought it was important not only to see the Lion House through Susie's eyes, but also to learn some about the women who had sacrificed much in obeying what they felt was the Lord's commandment for them to practice plural marriage. We are careful in Saints to not introduce too many characters. We don't want the book to get too confusing or the details to be too dizzying or difficult to track. But in this scene, we thought it important that the readers learn about Susie's mother, Lucy Bigelow Young, and her sister wives, Zina Huntington Young, Emily Partridge Young, Clara Decker Young, and Eliza Snow. We thought it was important to hear from Brigham on his views of plural marriage. We include his quote that he experienced a great trial of faith when Joseph Smith introduced him to the practice, and that he had to pray unceasingly to develop faith to move forward. Personal revelation was required. Finally, we thought it important that we not only see the Lion House as a place of bustling activity, of children sliding down banisters and large family meals being made. We include in the scene the daily practice of Brigham, ringing a bell at night to call the large family to one central place for family discussion and family prayer. Now, we don't leave Susie as a 9-year-old. We meet her repeatedly throughout the rest of Volume 2 and then in Volume 3 as well. We see her move along with her mother and sister to St. George in the 1870s. Brigham spent the winters at St. George because of his arthritis. We learn that she helped her sister Dora elope and be married by a Protestant minister to a young man. The marriage was devastating to Susie's mother. We then see Susie herself as a young wife and mother whose husband, a cousin of Dora's husband, though a member of the church, became an alcoholic and was verbally and likely physically abusive to Susie and her children. When Susie's father, Brigham, sends her husband on a mission to England, probably with the intent of encouraging reform, Susie realizes that she's much happier when he's gone. She goes to visit her father on one occasion while her husband is on his mission, asking if she might join a national speaking tour to help change perceptions of Latter-day Saint women. Brigham is elderly at the time. He would die within the month. Susie's own faith was not yet solid, she told Brigham. "I wish I knew the gospel was true," she said. Brigham replied, "There is only one way, daughter, that you can get the testimony of the truth. And this is the way I attained my testimony, and the way your mother got hers, on your knees before the Lord. Go in prayer, and he will hear and answer." Susie felt a powerful spirit as her father spoke to her. "If it had not been for Mormonism," he said, "I would be today a carpenter in a country village." We thought it important that Brigham's final testimony in Saints did not come in general conference or before a congregation. Rather, it came as a father helping his daughter in a moment of crisis. After Brigham's death, Susie tries to figure out what to do with her failing marriage. Her father had told her before his death that her roles as a wife and mother were central to her success. Saints says, Volume 2 says, Susie wanted to fulfill those roles righteously. But did that mean she had to stay in an abusive marriage? She had to dream that she and her husband were visiting her father, and Brigham gave an assignment to Susie that he would normally have given to her husband. In the dream, she then saw Eliza Snow and asked why her father had given her the assignment and not her husband. Eliza said in the dream, he did not understand then, but he does now. For Susie, it was a message from Brigham, from beyond the veil. It was right for her to leave the abusive marriage, which she did in a difficult divorce. Susie continues to be a character. We see her on a visit to Hawaii where she meets missionary Jacob Gates. We see Susie pursue an education at Brigham Young Academy. We see her and Jacob marry and raise a large family, including a daughter, Leah. We follow Leah as she is courted by John A. Widtsoe, who we first met when his mother Anna was living in Scandinavia and converting to the church. Leah and John become important characters for us in Volume 3. Key number 3. Many people today believe that Brigham was a practical leader, by which they mean that he was not much of a spiritual leader. They are wrong. Brigham was a profoundly spiritual man. Yes, he had a gift for practical leadership, for organizing, for colonizing. But this was also a man who spoke in tongues, overcome by the Holy Spirit, the first time that he met Joseph Smith. Throughout Volume 2, we wanted to present Brigham as a spiritual leader. Take, for instance, the chapter that discusses the saints in winter quarters in early 1847 as they prepared for the trek across the plains. We find Brigham praying day after day so he could know how to lead the people. Saint states, after almost a year on the trail, Brigham had learned that organizing and equipping the saints for the road west, for the road ahead, was vital to their success. Yet setback after setback had also shown him how important it was to rely on the Lord and follow his direction. As in the days of Joseph, only the Lord could direct his church. As Brigham prayed and pondered, he felt the Lord open his mind to new understanding. It's in that context that he begins to record a revelation that today we know as Doctrine and Covenants, section 136, the word and will of the Lord. The revelation was so significant for the saints. One woman wrote, "The Lord has once more remembered his servants and favored them with a revelation of his will. Peace and unity reign in our midst, and the Spirit of God is prevalent among us." The next scene depicts Brigham wrestling with another topic, sealing by spiritual adoption. This was a practice in which some Latter-day Saints whose parents had not joined the church were sealed by adoption to prominent church leaders. Wilford Woodruff later received a revelation that clarified that we should be sealed to our own ancestors, not to church leaders. Brigham felt confused about this practice, and he saw that it was creating some division among the saints, as there was some competition among saints as to who they should be sealed to. Brigham sought more knowledge on the subject, and he had a dream, which he saw Joseph Smith sitting in a chair in front of a large window. Taking Joseph's hand, Brigham asked his friend why he could not be with the saints. "It is all right," Joseph said. In the dream, Brigham then asked him about the law of adoption or sealing practices. "If you have a word of counsel for me," he told Joseph, "I should be glad to receive it." Joseph responded, "Tell the people to be humble and faithful, and sure to keep the Spirit of the Lord. If they will find themselves just as they were organized by our Father in heaven before they came into the world." Brigham's questions weren't completely answered by that statement, but he took great comfort in the counsel for the people to be humble, trust in the Spirit of the Lord, and await further revelation. Nothing illustrates Brigham as a spiritual leader better than his relationship with the temple. Brigham believed deeply in the importance of the temple. He worked on, contributed to the Kirtland Temple, and was present when the great spiritual manifestations of the dedication, around the time of the dedication, happened. He then served a mission to England and was there when the Nauvoo Temple was announced. But when he returned from that mission, the first part of the temple to be dedicated was the baptismal font. Dedicated in fall 1842, so the saints could move their baptisms from the dead from the Mississippi River inside the temple. Joseph Smith turned to Brigham and asked if he would perform the dedication of the font. Brigham worked tirelessly on the Nauvoo Temple, raising funds and using his skills as a craftsman to push the temple towards completion. In 1843, Brigham was among the first 9 men to receive the endowment ordinance from the prophet Joseph Smith. And he was soon sealed to his wife, Mary Ann, and then to other women as plural wives. After the death of Joseph Smith, Brigham had a profoundly important decision to make. It was apparent that the saints would have to leave Nauvoo. Their enemies were too numerous and too powerful, and the temple was not close to completion. What should they do? Should they risk violence and stay and complete the temple, knowing that all of their work, their funds, their dedication would be poured into a building that they would then abandon? The pressures were immense, and Brigham felt responsible for the safety of the saints. He took the question, the dilemma, to the Lord. The answer came clearly in a revelation that Brigham recorded. He wrote in his journal, I inquired of the Lord whether we should stay here and finish the temple. The answer was, we should. From that moment, Brigham displayed no doubt. They would leave Nauvoo, but not until the temple was finished. After the saints arrived in St. George, Brigham dedicated the temple site in 1853 and supervised its construction. When it was apparent it wouldn't be finished in his lifetime, he directed that a temple be built in St. George that he would hopefully live to dedicate. In the temporary structures of the endowment house on Temple Square, not all of the temple ordinances were performed. Sealings, yes. Endowments for the living, yes. But not endowments for the dead. Not the great work of saving our ancestors. He wanted a temple built so he could finish teaching the saints how to move that work forward. In fall 1876, he traveled south to St. George. The temple would be dedicated on New Year's Day. He wanted to be present. A more formal dedication would happen at the April General Conference, which would also be held in St. George. By this point, Brigham must have sensed that he was near death. He had significant health problems that left him sick for the month before the temple dedication. Rheumatism and arthritis in his feet made walking very painful. But there was no chance that he would miss the dedication. He struggled to arrive at the St. George Temple on the morning of New Year's Day when 1,200 people squeezed into the temple. They first dedicated the baptistry in the basement. Brigham sat in a chair which had been fitted with rollers so that he could be moved within the temple. And when they were finished dedicating the baptistry, 4 strong men carried the chair with Brigham in it up the stairs to the main floor, where another dedication of that floor occurred. And then a smaller group, including Brigham once again being carried in his chair, went upstairs to dedicate the sealing rooms. It was a momentous day for the saints. For the first time in 3 decades, they had a dedicated temple. And it would be a temple unlike the temples in Kirtland and Nauvoo, or the temporary buildings such as the endowment house. For here they would perform all the ordinances for the dead. At the end of the dedication, Brigham, leaning on his cane, went to the pulpit in the temple. He delivered a powerful sermon, both in lifting the eyes of the saints towards eternity and in condemning some of the saints for their worldliness. On the topic of temple work for the dead, he said, "When I think upon this subject, I want the tongues of 7 thunders to wake up the people. Can the fathers be saved without us? No. Can we be saved without them? No. And if we do not wake up and cease to long after the things of this earth, we will find that we as individuals will go down to hell." He lamented that too many saints were chasing the things of this world rather than the things of eternity. "Supposing we were awake to this thing, namely the salvation of the human family," he said, "this house would be crowded, as we hope it will be, from Monday morning until Saturday night." At the close of the sermon, Brigham said, "I do not know whether this people are satisfied or not. I am not half satisfied, and I never expect to be satisfied until the devil is whipped and driven from the face of the earth." He picked up his cane and struck the pulpit so forcefully that it left dents in the wood. I think this is another really powerful image of Brigham. Here he is in the twilight of his life, emphasizing to the people what he believes is most important: spiritual work, temple work, leaving behind the things of the world and advancing the work of God. Brigham's work in the St. George Temple didn't end there. A week later, he went to the temple to see the first baptism for the dead performed. It was his daughter Susie being baptized for one of her friends. He then supervised the first endowments for the dead in the temple. He stayed in St. George for some months. He wrote to relatives asking for personal genealogical information. His own parents were still together as his son Brigham Jr. stood proxy. He participated as several of his own children received their endowments. Perhaps most significantly for us, Brigham asked Wilford Woodruff and George Buchanan and others to write down the words of the endowment and the temple ordinances. And then, working together, they sought to fulfill a charge that Joseph Smith had given to Brigham after the first endowments in Nauvoo. This is not arranged right, but we have done the best we could under the circumstances. I wish you to take this matter in hand and organize and systematize all these ceremonies. After the April conference of the church, Brigham traveled back to Salt Lake City, where he would die in August of that year. But on the way back, Brigham selected and dedicated a site in the Sanpete Valley for another temple, this one in Manti. I hope that through Saints Volume 2, readers today are able to understand Brigham Young, that they see him as the 19th century saints saw him, as a leader who cared deeply for the saints and felt deeply the burden of being their leader and the Lord's prophet on the earth, as a man who loved and sought to guide his family, and as a spiritual leader who sought revelation and who pushed forward the building of temples and the advancing of temple work throughout his life. So if you haven't done so, I encourage you to read Saints Volume 2. And I hope that you're looking forward to Volume 3. We are hard at work and anticipate a release of that volume in late 2021 or early 2022. Thank you.